I never thought I'd be writing this story. After 12 years as a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington State, I always prided myself on being level-headed, rational, and unshakable. I've dealt with everything from aggressive black bears to lost hikers in blizzards, from illegal campers to search and rescue operations that lasted days. Nothing ever rattled me until October 23rd, 2024. That was the day I encountered something that forced me to question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I dedicated my career to protecting. My name is Jonathan. It is not my real name, but I want to remain anonymous. I'm writing this 3 weeks after submitting my resignation to the National Park Service. Friends, family, and former colleagues all think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. But what I experienced in the remote backcountry of the Olympic Peninsula was so profoundly disturbing that I can no longer set foot in those woods without breaking into a cold sweat. October in Olympic National Park is usually one of my favorite times of year. The summer crowds have thinned out, the autumn colors are spectacular, and there's a peaceful quiet that settles over the temperate rainforest. I'd been assigned to patrol the Bogachiel River Trail system, a remote area that sees maybe a dozen visitors per week during the off-season. It's pristine wilderness, towering Sitka spruces, moss-draped maples, and crystal-clear streams that seem untouched by human presence. I was conducting my routine 3-day backcountry patrol, checking trail conditions, monitoring wildlife activity, and ensuring no unauthorized camping was taking place. The first 2 days went exactly as expected. I cataloged some storm damage from the previous week's windstorm, noted a family of Roosevelt elk near mile marker 7, and documented water levels at various creek crossings. Everything was completely normal. On the morning of October 23rd, I hiked deeper into the backcountry than usual, following an old elk trail that branched off from the main path around mile marker 12. I'd heard reports from a couple of backpackers about unusual tree damage in that area. Massive branches broken at heights no bear could reach, strange markings carved into bark. As a ranger, it was my job to investigate and document any unusual activity that might indicate illegal camping, vandalism, or potentially dangerous wildlife behavior. The hike to the reported area took about 2 hours through increasingly dense forest. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the light filtered down in thin, ethereal beams. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled by the thick moss covering everything. When I reached the area described by the backpackers, I immediately understood their concern. The damage was unlike anything I'd seen in over a decade of wilderness work. Massive Douglas fir branches, some as thick as my torso, had been snapped clean off at heights of 15 to 20 feet. The breaks weren't clean cuts from wind or weather, they looked deliberate, almost twisted off. Bark had been stripped from several trees in long vertical gouges that extended from ground level up to about 10 feet high. I began photographing and documenting everything, following standard protocol for unusual wildlife activity. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in a muddy depression near a small creek, partially filled with rainwater but still clearly defined. Each print was massive, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at the widest point. The depth suggested incredible weight. My own boot prints in the same mud barely made an impression, but these tracks were pressed down nearly 3 inches deep. I'd seen plenty of bear tracks in my career, both black bear and the occasional grizzly that wandered down from Canada. These weren't bear tracks. The shape was wrong, too narrow, with what appeared to be distinct toe impressions. They looked almost human, but scaled up to an impossible size. I spent about an hour documenting the prints and the tree damage, taking photographs from multiple angles and making detailed notes in my ranger log. The rational part of my mind was working through possible explanations. Hoax prints made by someone with fake feet, unusual bear behavior, maybe even damage from illegal ATV use despite the remote location. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but it came from the forest around me rather than the sky. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I froze, listening intently. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was probably just a large tree falling somewhere in the distance, a common sound in old-growth forests. I continued my documentation, but the atmosphere had changed. The forest, which had been merely quiet before, now felt oppressive. Even the small sounds I'd been making, the click of my camera, the scratch of my pen on paper, seemed unnaturally loud. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, though I couldn't explain why. 20 minutes later, the sound came again. This time it was closer, and there was no mistaking it for a falling tree. It was organic, purposeful, a deep, guttural vocalization that seemed to come from something with massive lung capacity. The sound echoed through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the direction, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I stopped what I was doing and stood perfectly still, hand instinctively moving to the radio on my belt. But I was too far from any repeater towers. The radio had been useless for the past hour. I was completely alone. The third vocalization came just 5 minutes later, and this time there was no doubt about the direction. It came from directly ahead of me, maybe 50 yards into the dense undergrowth. Along with the sound came a smell, a thick, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something wilder, more primitive. I started backing away slowly, my ranger training kicking in. When dealing with potentially dangerous wildlife, the protocol is simple. Make yourself appear large, avoid direct eye contact, back away slowly, and make noise to discourage approach. I began speaking in a loud, firm voice. "Hey, get back. I'm leaving the area." That's when I saw it. About 40 yards away, standing between two massive cedar trees, was a figure that my brain initially refused to process. It was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, covered head to toe in dark brown hair that seemed to shimmer in the filtered sunlight. The proportions were almost human, but exaggerated. Incredibly broad shoulders, arms that hung down past where its knees should be, a barrel chest that must have been 4 feet across. But it was the face that froze me in place. It wasn't the face of an animal. The features were distinctly humanoid, a prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected intelligence, a flat nose, and a mouth that seemed capable of expression. As I stared at it, it stared back at me with what I can only describe as curiosity. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Neither of us moved. I was paralyzed by a combination of terror and fascination. This creature, whatever it was clearly studying me with the same intensity that I was studying it. The standoff ended when I made the mistake of reaching for my camera. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but the creature's reaction was immediate and terrifying. It let out a roar that shook the forest around us, a sound so primal and powerful that I felt it in my chest cavity. Then it began moving toward me. I've never seen anything move through dense forest like that creature did. While I would have to push through undergrowth, step over fallen logs, and navigate around obstacles, it seemed to flow through the terrain like water. Branches that would stop me in my tracks barely slowed it down. It covered ground with a fluid, loping gait that ate up distance at an alarming rate. I ran. All my ranger training about backing away slowly and avoiding sudden movements went out the window. Pure survival instinct kicked in, and I crashed through the forest as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me, I could hear the creature keeping pace easily. It wasn't even breathing hard, while I was already gasping for air after just a few minutes of panicked flight. The pursuit continued for what felt like miles, but was probably closer to half a mile. Every time I thought I might have lost it, I'd hear that distinctive rustling of something large moving through the trees behind me. At one point, I glanced back and saw a dark shape moving parallel to my path, about 50 yards to my left. It wasn't even following my route. It was cutting through the forest in a straight line, completely unimpeded by the terrain that was slowing me down. I finally reached a small clearing where an old landslide had taken out a section of forest years ago. The open space felt safer, and I stopped to catch my breath and get my bearings. My chest was heaving, my legs were shaking, and I was covered in scratches from branches and thorns. That's when I realized the forest had gone completely silent behind me. No more rustling, no more sounds of pursuit. I stood in the middle of the clearing, turning slowly in a circle, trying to spot any movement in the tree line. The creature appeared at the edge of the clearing, about 60 yards away. It didn't rush toward me or make any threatening gestures. Instead, it simply stood there, partially concealed behind a massive fir tree, and watched me. We stared at each other across the open space for several long minutes. Then it did something that still gives me chills when I think about it. The creature picked up a large rock, probably the size of a softball, and hurled it in my direction. Not at me, but about 10 feet to my left. The rock hit the ground with tremendous force and bounced several times before coming to rest. The message was clear. It could have hit me if it wanted to. The throw demonstrated accuracy, power, and most unsettling of all, restraint. This wasn't a mindless animal acting on instinct. This was something intelligent, something that was choosing not to harm me while making it clear that it easily could. I took the hint and began backing toward the far side of the clearing, never taking my eyes off the creature. When I reached the tree line on the opposite side, it made one final vocalization, lower and more controlled than its earlier roars, almost like it was speaking in its own language. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest with the same fluid grace it had shown during the chase. I stood there for another 10 minutes, listening for any sound of its return. When I was finally convinced it was gone, I began the longest hike of my life back to the main trail and then to my truck. The entire return journey took nearly 4 hours. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound and stopping frequently to listen for signs of pursuit. By the time I reached my vehicle, it was nearly dark and I was mentally and physically exhausted. That night, back at the ranger station, I sat at my desk staring at a blank incident report form. How do you document an encounter with something that officially doesn't exist? How do you explain to your supervisor that you spent the afternoon being chased through the forest by a 9-foot-tall humanoid creature? I ended up writing a vague report about unusual wildlife activity and possible bear encounter. I mentioned the tree damage and the large footprints, but described them in terms that could be interpreted as evidence of bear activity. I didn't mention the chase, the vocalizations, or the rock-throwing incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced. I went back through old incident reports, looking for any similar encounters. What I found disturbed me even more than my own experience. Over the past 5 years, there had been a pattern of report that I'd previously dismissed or rationalized away. Hikers reporting strange sounds in the backcountry, campers describing the feeling of being watched, trail maintenance crews finding unusual track formations, several incidents of hikers returning early from backcountry trips, claiming they felt uncomfortable or unsafe in areas where no dangerous wildlife had been documented. Reading through these reports with fresh eyes, I began to see a pattern. The incidents clustered around specific areas of the park, remote sections with limited human traffic. The descriptions of sounds, smells, and feelings of being watched were remarkably consistent across different witnesses who had no contact with each other. I spent the next 2 weeks obsessively researching Sasquatch encounters in the Pacific Northwest. What I discovered was a vast network of eyewitness accounts stretching back decades. Many from credible sources: law enforcement officers, military personnel, scientists, and yes, park rangers. The Olympic Peninsula in particular has a long history of such encounters. The dense forests, abundant water sources, and relative isolation make it ideal habitat for a large, elusive primate, if such a creature existed. The Native American tribes of the region have stories about SASQUATCH or Estzailes dating back centuries, giant, hairy beings that live in the deep forest and avoid human contact. I reached out to other park employees, both current and retired, asking casual questions about unusual wildlife encounters. The responses were eye-opening. 3 other rangers had experienced similar encounters over the years, but had never reported them officially. 2 trail maintenance workers described finding massive footprints that they dismissed as hoaxes. A retired supervisor admitted that he'd always suspected something unusual lived in the most remote sections of the park, but had never pursued the matter. Against my better judgment, I decided to return to the site of my encounter. I told myself it was for closure, to prove to myself that I'd simply overreacted to a routine bear encounter. Deep down, I think I knew better. I went back exactly 1 week after my initial encounter, this time bringing additional equipment, a better camera, a video recorder, and camping gear for an overnight stay. I told my supervisor I was conducting a follow-up investigation of the tree damage. I reached the site around noon and immediately noticed changes. Someone or something had been back since my encounter. The muddy area where I'd found the original footprints had been disturbed, and there were new tracks. Not just a few prints, but what appeared to be a well-used path leading from the creek up into the denser forest. I followed the trail for about a quarter mile before I found what I can only describe as a shelter. It wasn't made with tools. There were no cut edges or manufactured materials. Instead, large branches had been woven together and propped against a massive fallen log, creating a lean-to structure that could easily accommodate something 9 feet tall. The shelter was clearly being used. The ground inside was packed down, and there were signs of recent occupation. Fresh bedding material made from ferns and moss, the remains of what appeared to be meals, mostly vegetation and some animal bones, and most unsettling of all, several more footprints in the soft earth around the structure. I made the decision to camp nearby and observe the shelter from a concealed position. I set up my small tent about 100 yards away, hidden behind a fallen log and dense undergrowth, with a clear view of the structure. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds I'd never heard before. Low vocalizations echoed through the trees, not quite animal, not quite human. The familiar musky smell grew stronger, carried on the night breeze. Around 11 p.m., I saw movement near the shelter. A large, dark shape emerged from the forest and approached the structure. Even in the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could see it was the same creature from my first encounter. Massive, bipedal, moving with that same fluid grace. For a brief moment, as it passed through a patch of moonlight, I managed to capture several photographs and a short video clip. The creature seemed to sense something was wrong and quickly retreated into the deeper shadows. I didn't attempt to follow or get closer footage. I'd learned my lesson about respecting their space. The creature didn't return that night, but I could hear movement in the forest around my position until dawn. I was being watched, evaluated, perhaps even protected in some way. The sounds weren't threatening, more like a guardian presence, ensuring I didn't venture closer to their territory. When I returned to the ranger station the next morning, I had something I'd never expected to possess: actual photographic and video evidence of my encounter. The images were brief and somewhat blurry, taken in low light conditions with a telephoto lens, but they clearly showed a large, bipedal, hair-covered figure that matched nothing in any field guide. I made copies of everything and stored them in a secure location, but I knew I couldn't include them in any official report. The Park Service has no protocol for handling cryptid evidence, and releasing such material would likely result in unwanted attention, media circus, and potential harm to the creatures I now believed needed protection. I filed a report documenting the shelter, the footprints, and the unusual wildlife activity without mentioning my overnight observation or the photographic evidence. I recommended that the area be temporarily closed to public access pending further investigation. The Park Service took my report seriously enough to send a team of wildlife biologists to investigate the site. I wasn't included in the investigation team, officially because I was too close to the situation, but I suspect my supervisors were beginning to question my reliability. The investigation team found the shelter, the footprints, and all the evidence I had documented. Their official report described the findings as consistent with unknown large mammal activity and recommended continued monitoring of the area. Privately, one of the biologists told me that they'd found evidence of multiple individuals using the area regularly. Hair samples had been collected, but the DNA analysis came back as inconclusive, not matching any known North American mammal species. The area was quietly closed to public access, with signs posted about wildlife research activities. No mention was made of the specific nature of the wildlife being studied. Despite the validation of having my findings taken seriously, I found that I couldn't continue working in the park. Every patrol, every backcountry assignment, I was constantly looking over my shoulder. The knowledge that these creatures were out there, living in the areas I was supposed to be protecting and monitoring, made it impossible for me to do my job effectively. The photographic evidence I'd obtained weighed heavily on my conscience. I had proof of something extraordinary, but I also had a responsibility to protect these beings from the chaos that would surely follow if the evidence became public. The burden of the secret became overwhelming. After 12 years with the Park Service, I submitted my resignation on November 15th, 2024. My official reason was family obligations, but my supervisor knew the real reason. In our final meeting, he told me that I wasn't the first ranger to leave under similar circumstances. There are things in these old forests that we don't understand, he said. The Park Service's job is to protect the wilderness, and sometimes that means protecting things we can't officially acknowledge. 3 weeks after my resignation, I'm still processing what I experienced. I've talked to cryptozoologists, Bigfoot researchers, and other witnesses of similar encounters. The stories are remarkably consistent. Intelligent, massive humanoid creatures living in the deep wilderness, avoiding human contact but occasionally encountered by people who venture too far into their territory. I've also learned that I'm far from the first park ranger to have such an encounter. There's an informal network of current and former Park Service employees who've had similar experiences. Most never reported them officially, knowing it would end their careers. Those who did report them often found themselves transferred to different locations or encouraged to find other employment. The question I'm left with is this: if these creatures exist, and I'm now convinced they do, what obligation do we have to protect them? They're clearly intelligent, They avoid human contact, and they seem to pose no threat to people who respect their space and don't intrude on their territory. Perhaps the Park Service's unofficial policy of quiet acknowledgement and protection is the right approach. These creatures have survived in the wilderness for who knows how long. They don't need our management or interference. They just need their habitat protected from human encroachment. I don't know what comes next for me professionally. My experience in wildlife management and wilderness protection is extensive, but I can't bring myself to work in large forested areas anymore. I'm considering a move to desert environments, places where the biggest mystery is a rare species of lizard or an unusual bird migration pattern. The photographs and video I obtained remain secure, viewed only by myself and a few trusted researchers in the cryptozoology community. They serve as personal validation of my experience, but I've made the decision to keep them private to protect these remarkable beings. But I'll never forget what I saw on the Olympic Peninsula. I'll never forget the intelligence in those dark eyes, the purposeful way that creature moved through its forest home, or the restraint it showed in dealing with a human who had stumbled into its world. People ask me if I believe in Bigfoot now. The question seems almost quaint. It's not a matter of belief anymore. It's a matter of acceptance. There are things in our wilderness areas that science hasn't cataloged, creatures that have learned to avoid human detection so effectively that they've become legends. I was privileged to encounter them, terrified by the experience, and ultimately humbled by the realization that there's still so much about our natural world that we don't understand. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are deeper, older, and more mysterious than most people realize. They hold secrets that challenge our understanding of what's possible. I'm grateful for the experience, even though it ended my career, because it reminded me that wonder and mystery still exist in our increasingly mapped and monitored world. For those who might read this and think about venturing into the deep wilderness in search of their own encounter, I offer this advice. Respect the forest and its inhabitants, whatever they might be. If you're lucky or unlucky enough to have your own encounter, remember that you're the visitor in their home. And if you see something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the natural world, don't be too quick to dismiss it. Sometimes the most extraordinary explanation is the correct one. But Jonathan's story is not the only one. A few years back, another story surfaced of a wildlife photographer who also had to end earlier than anticipated their stay at a remote cabin deep in the woods. I'm writing this with shaking hands, 3 weeks after the most terrifying experience of my life. My name is Marcus Webb, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a freelance wildlife photographer specializing in rare and endangered species. The keyword there is was, because after what happened to me in the Olympic National Forest, I'm done. I've sold all my camera equipment, deleted my website, and I'm never setting foot in remote wilderness again. What I'm about to tell you sounds impossible. Hell, if someone had told me this story a month ago, I would have laughed in their face. But I have the photos to prove it, at least the ones that survived. And more importantly, I have the scars to remind me that some things in this world are better left undiscovered. It started with what seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. Dr. Patricia Henley, a conservation biologist from the University of Washington, contacted me through my website in early October. She explained that she was working on a comprehensive study of endangered species in the Pacific Northwest and needed high-quality photographs of several elusive animals for a major publication and funding proposal. The list was ambitious: Pacific marten, northern spotted owl, Olympic marmot, and if I was extremely lucky, maybe even a wolverine, an animal so rare in Washington that confirmed sightings could be counted on one hand. The pay was exceptional, $2,500 per confirmed photograph of the target species, with a $10,000 bonus if I could document a wolverine. For a freelancer who'd been scraping by on wedding gigs and stock photography, this was my golden ticket. Dr. Henley had identified a remote section of the Olympic National Forest, about 40 miles southeast of Port Angeles, where recent trail camera footage had captured glimpses of several target species. The area was accessible only by a grueling 8-mile hike through dense forest and steep terrain, which explained why so few photographers had ventured there. Perfect for someone like me, who'd built a reputation on going where others wouldn't. I spent 2 weeks preparing. I researched the terrain, studied the behavioral patterns of each species, and invested in new cold weather gear since November in the Olympics could be brutal. My camera bag contained 2 DSLR bodies, 4 different telephoto lenses, extra batteries, memory cards, and a lightweight camping setup that would let me stay in the field for up to a week. On November 3rd, I drove my Subaru as far as the Forest Service road would allow. parked at a trailhead that hadn't seen maintenance in years, and began the trek into what locals called the Green Cathedral, a section of old-growth forest so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy even at midday. The first few miles were standard Pacific Northwest hiking, steep switchbacks, muddy trails, and the constant drip of moisture from towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of my boots squelching through wet leaves and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the green twilight around me. By late afternoon, I reached the area Dr. Henley had marked on my GPS. It was a small valley surrounded by steep ridges, with a creek running through the center and several natural clearings that looked perfect for wildlife photography. I set up my base camp in a grove of massive cedar trees, positioning my tent so I had clear sightlines to the meadows where animals would most likely appear during dawn and dusk feeding times. The first 2 days were frustratingly unproductive. I captured a few shots of Roosevelt elk and black-tailed deer, beautiful animals, but not what I was being paid to photograph. The forest felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It was too quiet, too empty. In my 15 years of wildlife photography, I'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a healthy ecosystem, and this place felt hollow. On the third morning, November 6th, I finally had some luck. While photographing what I hoped might be Pacific marten tracks along the creek, I heard the distinctive call of a northern spotted owl, one of my target species. I spent the next 4 hours tracking the sound through the forest, and just before sunset, I found her, a magnificent female spotted owl perched on a branch about 60 feet up in an old-growth Douglas fir. I managed to capture nearly 100 photos before she flew away, including several shots that I knew would make Dr. Henley ecstatic. The $2,500 commission was in the bag. Feeling optimistic for the first time since arriving, I returned to camp as darkness settled over the forest. That night, something woke me around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a falling branch, but as I lay in my sleeping bag listening, I heard it again. A deep, rhythmic thumping sound like someone pounding on a hollow log. It came from somewhere across the creek, maybe a quarter mile away, and it continued for nearly 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. I'd heard woodpeckers drumming before, but never at night and never with that deep, resonant quality. Whatever was making that sound was large, very large. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent flap, but the beam barely penetrated 20 feet into the dense forest. The thumping didn't resume, so eventually I went back to sleep, though it took hours. November 7th started with incredible luck. While reviewing the spotted owl photos on my camera's LCD screen, I noticed movement in the forest, about 200 yards from my camp. Through my telephoto lens, I could see a small, dark shape moving through the understory with the characteristic bounding gait of a Pacific marten, another target species worth $2,500. I spent the morning stalking the animal, which seemed unusually bold for a species known to be extremely shy around humans. The marten led me deeper into the forest than I'd ventured before, to an area where the trees were so massive and ancient that walking between them felt like moving through the columns of a cathedral. I was so focused on photographing the marten that I almost missed it. A massive, dark shape moving through the trees about 100 yards ahead. At first glance, I thought it was a black bear, but something about its movement was wrong. It was walking upright. My heart began pounding as I raised my camera and switched to my longest telephoto lens. Through the viewfinder, I could see the figure more clearly, and what I saw made my hands shake so violently I could barely keep the camera steady. It was roughly 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with impossibly broad shoulders and long, muscular arms that swung as it walked. Its head was proportionally small compared to its massive body, with a pronounced sagittal crest, the bony ridge that runs along the top of the skull, that was clearly visible even from a distance. Most unsettling of all, it moved with obvious intelligence, pausing occasionally to examine trees or peer into the distance as if scanning for threats. I took over 50 photographs in the span of 3 minutes, my camera's motor drive whirring continuously as I documented the creature's movements. It seemed unaware of my presence at first, providing me with clear, well-lit shots as it moved through a patch of filtered sunlight. Some part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that Bigfoot was a myth, a hoax, a product of overactive imaginations and blurry footage. But the evidence was right there in my viewfinder, and my camera was capturing every detail. My luck ran out when I tried to move closer for a better angle. I was creeping through the underbrush, focused entirely on the creature through my telephoto lens, when I stepped on a rotted branch that snapped with a crack like a gunshot. The creature's head whipped looked around, and for the first time, I saw its face clearly. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not quite human, not quite ape, but something disturbingly in between. Its eyes were dark and intelligent, with an unmistakably hostile glare that made my blood run cold. When it bared its teeth, I saw canines that belonged on a predator, not an herbivore. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we stared at each other across the 100 yards of forest floor. Then it began moving toward me, not running, but walking with deliberate, measured steps that covered ground with terrifying efficiency. Each stride was easily twice the length of mine. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face and camera gear bouncing against my back. I fled toward my camp with the creature somewhere behind me. I could hear it following, not the chaotic crashing you'd expect from a panicked animal, but the steady, methodical sound of something large moving through the forest with purpose. When I reached my camp, I dove into my tent and zipped it shut, as if a few millimeters of nylon could protect me from something that could probably tear a grizzly bear in half. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate my camera to review the photos I'd taken, but they were there, crystal clear evidence of something that wasn't supposed to exist. As darkness fell, I realized I was trapped. My car was 8 miles away through terrain I could barely navigate in daylight, let alone in the pitch black forest at night. And somewhere out there, something that had every reason to be angry with me was probably watching my camp. Around midnight, the sound started. First, it was tree knocks, the same deep, rhythmic thumping I'd heard the night before, but closer now, coming from multiple directions around my camp. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate impacts that circled my tent in a slow, methodical pattern. Whatever was out there was taking its time, and it wanted me to know it was there. The worst part was the breathing. Deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that were clearly audible over the sound of my own hammering heartbeat. At one point, I heard sniffing right outside my tent wall, so close I could have reached out and touched whatever was making the sound through the fabric. I lay in my sleeping bag, paralyzed with terror, clutching a canister of bear spray in one hand and my camera in the other. The logical part of my mind kept insisting this couldn't be happening, that Bigfoot was a myth, that I was probably being stalked by a black bear or having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I'd seen the creature clearly, photographed it in perfect detail, and no bear I'd ever encountered moved with that kind of intelligence. Around 3 a.m., the sound stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural silence that was somehow more terrifying than the stalking had been. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my gear with shaking hands and prepared to make the 8-mile hike back to my car. I'd gotten the photographs I needed, more than I'd ever dreamed of, but no amount of money was worth spending another night in that forest. As I broke down my camp, I noticed details I'd missed in my terror the night before. There were footprints in the soft earth around my tent, massive, human-like tracks with 5 distinct toes, and a heel that left impressions nearly 2 inches deep. The tracks circled my campsite completely, with several sets leading off into the trees in different directions. More disturbing were the broken branches. Several young trees near my camp had been snapped off about 8 feet from the ground, too high for any known animal except maybe a bull moose, and there were no moose in this part of the Olympics. The breaks were clean and appeared fresh, as if something had grabbed the trees and simply twisted them until they snapped. I took photographs of the evidence, then packed my gear and started the long hike back to civilization. Every rustling leaf and creaking branch sent spikes of adrenaline through my system. I felt like I was being watched the entire time, though I never saw the creature again. When I finally reached my car, I'd never been so happy to see a parking lot in my life. I drove straight home to Seattle without stopping, and the first thing I did was upload the photographs to my computer. What I saw on my monitor made my hands start shaking all over again. The photos were incredible. Over 50 clear, high-resolution images of something that science insisted didn't exist. The creature was captured in perfect detail. Its massive musculature, its human-like hands with opposable thumbs, its intelligent eyes, and its distinctly non-human facial features. These weren't blurry, indistinct shapes that could be dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. They were documentary-quality photographs that would revolutionize cryptozoology if they were ever made public. But as I studied the images more closely, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. In several of the later photographs, the creature wasn't just walking through the forest randomly. It was following following a specific path that would have intersected with my location. It had been tracking me from the moment I first spotted it, and I'd been too focused on getting the perfect shot to realize I was being hunted. I never contacted Dr. Henley. I never submitted the photographs. Instead, I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could find about Bigfoot encounters in the Pacific Northwest. And what I discovered made me even more convinced that I'd made the right decision to run. There were dozens of similar stories: hikers who'd encountered massive bipedal creatures in remote forests, loggers who'd found evidence of something large and intelligent living in areas that were supposed to be uninhabited, and photographers who'd captured brief glimpses of something that shouldn't exist. Most disturbing were the stories that didn't have happy endings. Missing persons cases in remote wilderness areas where search teams found massive footprints but no trace of the victims. I realized that I'd been incredibly lucky. The creature could have killed me easily if it had wanted to, but for whatever reason, it had chosen to let me go. Maybe it was curious about me. Maybe it was just territorial and wanted me gone. Or maybe it was intelligent enough to understand that harming a human would bring unwanted attention to its territory. Whatever the reason, I wasn't about to push that luck by trying to profit from the encounter. 3 weeks later, I'm finally ready to tell the story, though I'm still not sharing the photographs. I've deleted most of them, keeping only a few on an encrypted drive that I'll probably never open again. The world isn't ready for proof that something like this exists, and frankly, I don't think it should be ready. Some things are better left hidden in the deep forest where they belong. I've sold all my camera equipment and started working as a technical writer for a software company in Seattle. It's boring, predictable work that keeps me in climate-controlled offices and suburban coffee shops. Exactly what I need right now. My friends and family think I've lost my mind, giving up a career I'd spent 15 years building for a desk job, but they don't understand what I saw in that forest. The creature I photographed wasn't just some unknown animal or evolutionary throwback. It was intelligent, possibly more intelligent than we want to admit. It had been watching me long before I spotted it, learning my patterns and routines. When I finally saw it, it wasn't an accident. It was because the creature allowed me to see it. And when I ran, it let me go, but not before making sure I understood that I was in its territory, subject to its rules. I'm sharing this story not to convince anyone that Bigfoot exists. Frankly, I don't care if you believe me or not. I'm sharing it as a warning to other wildlife photographers and outdoor enthusiasts who might be tempted to venture into remote wilderness areas looking for the unknown. There are things in those forests that we don't understand, things that have learned to avoid human contact for very good reasons. The Pacific Northwest contains thousands of square miles of wilderness so remote that humans rarely penetrate more than a few miles from established trails. In terrain that vast, it's entirely possible for large, intelligent creatures to exist without ever being definitively documented by science. If you're a photographer or researcher planning to venture into remote wilderness areas, especially in the Pacific Northwest, please consider my story carefully. The evidence I captured could have made me famous and wealthy, but it also nearly got me killed. Some photographs aren't worth taking, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The creature I encountered spared my life, but I have no illusions that every such encounter ends peacefully. There are too many missing persons cases in remote wilderness areas, too many stories of hikers who ventured into the deep forest and never came back. I was lucky, but luck has a way of running out. As I write this, I keep thinking about those intelligent eyes staring at me across 100 yards of forest floor. Whatever I encountered out there wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. It was something that could think, plan, and make decisions based on complex reasoning. It chose to reveal itself to me, chose to follow me, and ultimately chose to let me leave alive. The question that haunts me isn't whether Bigfoot exists. I know it does. The question is what these creatures want and whether humanity is ready for that conversation. Based on my encounter, I suspect they've been watching us far longer than we've been looking for them, and they've made a conscious decision to remain hidden. Maybe that's for the best. After all, look what we've done to every other species we've discovered. Maybe the real question isn't whether we can prove these creatures exist, but whether they can trust us with that knowledge. I hope I never find out the answer. Note: Marcus Webb has declined all interview requests and has not responded to attempts to verify his story. The photographs mentioned in this account have not been made available for analysis. This story is presented as submitted without editorial verification. If you would like to hear more interesting Bigfoot stories, check this out. Thanks for watching.